Since magic can be used to burn enemies, it can also be used to boil water. Since magic-like puppets can automatically defend against enemies, they can also become automated machine tools. The necromancer enjoys playing with life. Could you please kill all the microorganisms in the can? The poison master kills a city with a bottle of potion. As long as the microorganisms on the wound are poisoned, it is a success. The planting master drives plants to be like hands, first increasing the sugar content of sugar beets to 20% before cultivating wheat. This is the most beautiful era. This is the era when magicians have become laborers. Keywords of the novel. Industrialized Lord without pop-ups. Download the complete set of Industrialized Lord TXT, and read the latest chapters of Industrialized Lord. Chapter 1. Digging the River Before Getting Rich. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Digging the river before getting rich. In the scorching summer, birds sing in the forest, insects dance happily by the river, rabbits remain vigilant while eating grass, and slime softens into a puddle under the shade of trees to digest the food in his stomach. Two sturdy horses unloaded their harnesses and leisurely ate the green grass by the river. The drivers squatted by the river, washing the wild chickens they had caught today with clear river water. Several hunters scattered around, wary of the dangerous presence of warcraft. Not far from the other side of the river, you can see a castle spire tower. A child sat on the grass by the river, holding a writing board and parchment in one hand and a feather pen in the other, occasionally dipping ink into the ink bottle beside him, focusing on calculations. Frederick von Wesson looked at the final number and said helplessly, "This canal is about 16 kilometers long, with a bottom width of 20 meters and a depth of 4 meters. Including the slope, it is about 1.53 million cubic meters of soil. 830,000 cubic meters of soil within 2 meters can dig 5 cubic meters per person per day, and 700,000 cubic meters of soil below 2 meters can dig 3 cubic meters per person per day, which is approximately 400,000 working days. If the excavation is to be completed within a year, considering the need for about 1,500 rest and support personnel. The cost of a laborer for a year is 2 florins, so at least 3,000 gold coins are needed. In the Rhine League, currently 1 florin gold coin is equivalent to 20 Kreuz silver coins and 2,000 copper plates. Currently, 1 Reutz can buy 50 kilograms of wheat, and 3,000 florins is equivalent to 3,000 tons of wheat. Although the area of Weisenling is about 1,000 square kilometers, it was developed late with only over 3,000 hectares of arable land. Currently, the wheat yield is 700 kilograms per hectare, and the entire territory has nearly 30,000 people who do not eat or drink, which is not enough. A middle-aged butler standing next to Frederick said, "Sir, the king has ordered a fine of 5,000 florins to be paid within 5 years, which is equivalent to 17.5 kilograms of pure gold. The gold beads and utensils at home are enough to melt." Frederick shook his head angrily and said, "That old man William didn't have a good heart. He first forced the responsibility for the defeat onto his father who died in battle, and then demoted the Wesson family's title from count to baron. He pretended to let us spend 5 years preparing 5,000 florins, but he used this time to lick his own wounds. He has the strength to take our Wesson collar. Afeu, do you believe it or not? Our neighbor has become the king's hunting dog. After 2 years of healing, he will attack us and weaken us, and then we can share a few bones." He became increasingly angry as he spoke, his chest constantly heaving and his face turning red. Last year, the Rhine League and the Kingdom of Gaul fought a war, during which the Kingdom of Gaul raided the logistics camp of the Rhine League. His father risked his life to save the food and grass in the camp, losing less than 5%. In the end, they lost the battle, and the defeated pots flew back and forth, ultimately being pinned on the head of the late Earl of Wesson for failing to preserve their supplies. At the same time, there was also demotion and a huge fine. Frederick's mother passed away in sorrow and anger this spring. He cried so much at the funeral that he fainted. When he fell, he hit his head against a stone, and as a result, all memories of his previous life were restored. Frederick lay in the room for 3 days, digesting the memories in his mind, carefully studying the map, and finally came to the conclusion that it was his fault. This world is similar and unfamiliar to his hometown, not to mention magic and warcraft. The local geography looks like Europe, but there is a large continent added to the west of France and 2 teeth. The Caucasus region between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea to the east is a sea, and what's even more incredible is that the Sahara Desert across the Mediterranean is a dense forest here. As for the farther east, Frederick really wanted to have the opportunity to see it in the future. The Rhine League is a loose alliance, mainly characterized by tariff exemptions among its members, and a plethora of internal feudal lords in politics. Mergers and divisions occur from time to time, and only temporary unity is achieved when facing external enemies. To fight, you don't need to kill the king, and you can't do it either. You just need to eat the dogs of the surrounding kings, and the king will carefully consider the next step. Before the troops move, food and supplies go first, and in battle, money is what we fight. In order to make money, Frederick led his people to conduct on-site inspections of the land between 2 rivers in his territory. The upper reaches of the Schwabenrosat River, a tributary of the main river, and the Altmeer River, a tributary of the Danube River, are both within the Wesen territory. As long as these 2 rivers are connected by a canal, cargo ships can enter the Rhine River and then the North Sea from the main river to the north. If they enter the Danube River to the south, they can flow downstream and directly reach the Black Sea. Water transportation is the lowest cost mode of transportation. As long as the canal is opened, the transportation distance from north to south in the eastern region of the mainland will be greatly shortened, and the cost will be greatly reduced. At the same time, this area will also become a distribution center for goods in the surrounding inland areas. So Frederick planned to bring all his wealth to Soha, and besides digging a canal, he also built a small town on the riverbank as a logistics center. If he wants to develop his territory, he must have channels to purchase raw materials and energy, otherwise everything will be impossible to talk about. As long as the function of the canal is revealed, merchant ships gather and raw materials are available. At the same time, his planned new products can also be sold out through this, thereby gaining huge profits. After 5 years, if you win, you can develop like a snowball, but if you lose, you will hide your name and run away to become a scholar at the University of Constantinople. Not to mention anything else, there will be nothing more about Newton in this world. In the future, when students take math and physics exams, their eyes will be filled with Wesen, and they will even say things like, "Wesen's coffin cannot be pressed down." Afu saw the old master in a daze and silently sighed in his heart. Frederick is only 8 years old this year, and his young shoulders have shouldered the heavy burden of the entire family. The immense pressure on him can be imagined. "Afu," said Frederick, "I'll draw some maps later. You can take them to Nuremberg tomorrow to discuss with the Masons Guild. The total price of the canal and dock town should be controlled within 4,500 florins, which is victory." Ah Fu replied, "As you wish. Recently, I heard that there was a lot of rainstorm in the south, and floods occurred in the lower reaches of the Rhine River. There were many refugees. It would be very cheap to hire them." Frederick paused his drawing hand and thought for a moment before saying, "Then add one more thing. Those who come here to work can either live in a new town or open up land nearby after the project is completed." Well, actually, it's not just that. There are still many places here that can be cultivated into farmland. Let's take advantage of this opportunity to recruit more refugees to reclaim land. According to his calculations, 90% of Wesen's territory can be developed into farmland, and the population can increase to 50,000 in a few years. If business continues to develop, it is estimated that the population will increase by about 10,000 people. By the way, Frederick remembered one thing. We still have to go to the blacksmiths and carpenters' guilds, so many tools need to be prepared in advance. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Babies falling from the sky. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Babies falling from the sky. Barbecue is the oldest cooking method in history, and there is a saying here that, no barbecue, no banquet. Without grilled meat, it is not considered a banquet. The coachmen and hunters followed Frederick for a few days in the forest, and the young master naturally wanted to treat them to a meal. Although rabbits and pheasants were all hunted by hunters, and in the end, a few crouched by the fire and cooked them, the process of adding spices was done by Baron Wesson himself, which surprised the guests. There are various herbs in the forest, just pick a little and crush it into green mud, which looks a bit like the fate of an orc. Just wipe it on the meat to be roasted. After finishing their lunch, everyone walked over a stone bridge and arrived at the opposite bank of the river. The water wheels on the banks of the Schwaben-Riesat River, a tributary of the main river, are arranged in rows along the banks, with more than 10 huge water wheels spinning with a creaking sound. The wheat in the field was just harvested last month, and carts transporting wheat and flour were parked in front of the mill. Farther away are carpentry shops and blacksmith shops. The water wheel can drive carpentry shops with saws, lathes, drilling machines, etc. The blacksmith shops use mortar hammers to crush or heavy hammers for making iron, bellows, and grinding wheels. This row of hydraulic workshops is mostly owned by the Wesson family, and the rest are also the vassals of the Wesson family. Frederick asked the coachman and hunter to go home first and said to the butler, "Alfred, go and see the mill." Mills are one of the main sources of income for the Wesson family, grinding beans and other grains in addition to wheat. The two of them walked into a mill closest to them, and the steward saw the superior approaching. He piled up a smiling face to greet him, and Frederick waved his hand to keep him busy. There was a lot of noise in the mill, and various moving parts made harsh noises due to friction. Adding oil didn't have much effect. Frederick stood quietly on the side, watching as the main shaft of the water wheel used as the power source to drive the stone mill, while also driving a sieve made of horse tails and a windmill that separated particles of different weights with wind. He was thinking in his heart that there was something he could take out to make money from. With the current conditions, he could make a barely usable product, and the market was huge, which could become a cash cow for the family. After a while, the hurried sound of horse hooves stopped in front of the mill door, and a wizard of 16 or 17 years old hurriedly walked in. His footsteps were so anxious that the wand in his hand almost knocked over the wheat mover. Frederick frowned. Jurgen was a descendant of the knights under the Wesson family and one of the best young wizards in the territory. He was usually quite calm, but why was he so panicked today? Jurgen came to Frederick's side and whispered, "Sir, please hurry to the pier of Treuchtlingen, where many guests have come." Treuchtlingen is a small town located 8 kilometers southwest of Wessenberg, adjacent to the Altmeer River, a tributary of the Danube River. It is easily accessible by land. Frederick asked, "Where did the guests come from?" "Constantinople," Jurgen replied, "was embroiled in internal turmoil this spring. Scholars from the city's universities and libraries fled, and many people came along the Danube River, seemingly carrying a lot of things." Frederick almost jumped up upon hearing this and immediately said, "Go to the estate by Lake Brombach now and prepare them to receive guests. This matter must be done well. If there is a mistake, you can handle it yourself." Brombach Lake is located in the mountains about 10 kilometers north of Wessenberg, 5 or 6 kilometers long and 2 or 3 kilometers wide, with direct access by water. There is a considerable estate belonging to the Wessenberg family by the lake. When Frederick's father was still alive, he would hunt with his vassals there every autumn. What is most lacking in any world is talent. Last year in World War I, not only did Frederick lose his father, but also the 11 knights who went on the expedition did not return. Currently, the defense forces of Wesson's leadership are extremely empty, with only the remaining old knights Franz and rising stars such as Jürgen, Lothar, and Andrei supporting the scene. In the future, the development of the territory requires a variety of talents, whether they are self-cultivated or introduced from outside, they will never be underestimated. Frederick recently planned to go to the university in the southern city of Minxing to seek scholars to teach Jürgen and others, and also to teach himself. Now it's good, there's a large group of scholars from the academic atmosphere of Constantinople. If you can't keep them, Frederick can find a piece of frozen tofu and smash them to death. Frederick knew how to ride horses, and after finding 2 horses with Alfred, he quickly whipped towards Treuchtlingen, and the journey of over 8 kilometers was soon over. The pier outside the town was in a mess, and Frederick was startled when he arrived. There are also many mills on this side of the Altmere River, and there are many cargo ships parked on the dock for transporting wheat and flour. Now a large fleet has arrived, directly blocking the waterway. Old Knight Franz is stationed in Treuchtlingen and is currently conversing with an old man. This old man is extremely intelligent, with a big beard, holding a wand in his hand, wearing a dark robe, and a purple belt. "Sir," Alfred whispered to Frederick on the side, "among the scholars of Constantinople, only the wise recognized by the court are qualified to use purple belts." Frederick nodded and immediately went over to introduce himself to the old man, saying, "I am Baron Frederick von Wesen, the lord of this place. We welcome your excellency the sage to visit this place." After bowing to Frederick, the old man said in Rhine with an accent, "I am Manuel from the University of Constantinople. Our group is like rootless duckweed. I earnestly request a moment of rest in your place." When Frederick looked at Manuel, he found his face full of fatigue, and the people wearing robes on the ship were the same, probably not able to rest well for a long time. He asked, "Your Excellency Manuel, how many of you are there?" Manuel hesitated and replied, "We have 30.6 scholars, 70.2 professors, and 256 students from universities and libraries. Most of the books loaded on 50 ships are from Constantinople." Frederick nodded and turned solemnly to Alfred and Franz, saying, "You must immediately arrange for Lord Manuel and the rest of us to have food and lodging, and ensure that everyone has enough to eat and sleep well. If there is not enough, you should be immediately transferred from Wesenberg. Treuchtlingen town has a population of only over 1,000, with over 300 visitors, making it quite troublesome to receive. At present, the only church that can accommodate so many people at once is the Church of Light. Your Excellency Manuel," Frederick said with a bitter smile, "can you stay in church tonight?" Manuel hesitated, realizing that the Church of Light in the Rhine League region and the church in Constantinople were different factions and had contradictions between the two. They couldn't find a place to settle down along the way. Firstly, the middle and lower reaches of the Danube River are semi-agricultural and semi-nomadic areas, where people do not respect scholars. Secondly, the first major city encountered along the way, Venn City, did not accept them due to church affiliations. Alfred saw the other party's hesitation and said to Frederick, "Sir, why not let the guests squeeze into the court and the town hall separately?" Frederick's head was lined up, and those two places were indeed quite large and close enough to accommodate each other. So he immediately asked Manuel, "What do you think?" Manuel breathed a sigh of relief and nodded in agreement. Both sides began to get busy. Franz went to prepare accommodation and arrange for dinner makers. Alfred went directly to the mill by the river to buy flour and even had people go to various households to buy sausages. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Each of you possesses unique skills. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Each of you possesses unique skills. At dusk, many scholars and students from Constantinople gathered around several large pots in the square, holding bowls, waiting for the chef to prepare noodles. The place where noodles are eaten the most these days is in the Kingdom of Sardinia. They roll out the dough, cut it out one by one, and then dry it in the sun. At Weisenling, a noodle-making machine has already been used here. The feeding screw pushes the dough forward and finally out of the mold at the top of the cylinder. The round and flat noodles are now available, and someone just needs to rotate the handle on the side. The noodles are cooked and put into a bowl. Then, each person adds a spoonful of garlic sauce, a spoonful of vegetables, and a portion of sausage slices. After finishing the noodles, you can also go to the pot and ask for a bowl of noodle soup. For travelers who have suffered physical and mental exhaustion after a long journey, having a hot meal is equivalent to a luxurious feast. On the other hand, Frederick invited several scholars with noble status, including Manuel, to have dinner together at the town hall. There is no time to prepare luxury food. Tonight's main food is noodles, roast pork knuckle with pickled Chinese cabbage, seasonal vegetable chicken soup and wine pulled from the wine cellar in Wessenberg. After dinner, the dessert is only black crystal eggs, arranged like petals, which can satisfy a large amount of people. Manuel and others have been starving during this time, rarely getting off the ship, and every day they are cooked into a paste of black bread and various things. During the banquet, everyone had no interest in speaking, and it was rare for landlords to be willing to entertain them. Burying their heads down and eating hard is the most serious thing. After the meal was over, Frederick asked Manuel, "Do you have any plans for the future?" Manuel's eyes were full of confusion and he said helplessly, "I don't know, we can only go all the way and see where they are willing to take us in." After speaking, he raised his glass and drank the fine wine in one gulp, taking advantage of the good wine to drink more. Frederick gestured for Alfred to pour him wine, and after the glass was full, he asked, "I have a question. You are all rare scholars in the world, and we cannot invite you in the past. Why have you fallen so far?" Manuel fell silent, exchanged a glance with the other scholars, and finally let out a deep sigh, saying, "It was us who caused harm to everyone. I am a necromancer, and others can't hide from me in time. How could they take me in?" Then another scholar named Friedrich shook his head and said, "I am a poison master among pharmacists. I have been taken in, so I'm afraid I won't even dare to drink water." The third scholar named Diesel smiled bitterly and said, "Your Excellency may not have heard of me. Your butler should know that my explosive magic has tremendous power, but we cannot distinguish between enemy and self." Upon hearing this, Frederick looked at Alfred in surprise. He knew very little about this butler, only that Afyu had been saved by his father a long time ago, so he began to serve the Wesson family from then on, and no one knew about his past. Afyu just nodded. The fourth scholar, named Omet, spread his hands and said, "I am studying magic like puppets." However, in recent years, the destruction of magic has been rapidly changing, and the high defense advantages of magic like puppets have become increasingly unclear. Intelligence has always been inferior to that of humans, and they are expensive. No one is willing to use them anymore. The fifth scholar Matthias covered his face and said, "I am an imperial planter, but the plants I have cultivated are too fat and not very agile in battle." The sixth Monroe pointed to Matthias and said, "I am a tamer, I am the same as him." Finally, Manuel said, "They all came from the Rhine League to study in Constantinople when they were young, and now they are going home to try their luck." After listening to the six of them finish speaking, Frederick said seriously, "I heard that everyone has a unique skill. I'm not sarcastically mocking you, but I really think so. I have always believed that there is no useless magic, no inherently evil magic, only people who cannot use it in the right place. Your Excellency Manuel, if you and all the scholars do not mind, I invite you to rest at the estate by Lake Brombach. What I most hope for is for everyone to stay and continue their education and academic research here." The scene instantly became particularly quiet, with no one talking. No one here is a fool, and everyone knows the relationship between effort and reward. Manuel cast a deep glance at Frederick, trying to understand his thoughts. For a moment, he couldn't figure out whether this 8-year-old child had shown kindness or had ulterior motives. Besides that, Manuel asked, "Do we need to do anything else?" Frederick picked up his glass and took a sip of fruit juice, pondered carefully before saying, "I am planning to dig a canal in my territory to connect the Danube and Rhine rivers, and this place will become an emerging commercial center. If you run a school here, you will definitely be able to recruit many students, and their clothing, food, housing, and transportation can also provide tax revenue for the territory. You have also brought many books, and I believe they should be mainly in imperial language, so I plan to support you in translating them into Rhine. I will sell the Rhine version of the book and give you a commission. Of course, I will also ask you to do something. I will find some young people to train you, and when I encounter some magical difficulties, I will also seek your advice. Then he said to Friedrich, Your Excellency is a poison master, and I plan to fund your research on inexpensive drugs to expel roundworm disease without harming people. Ascariasis is a huge problem these years, with about 10% of people in urban areas being infected, and the infection rate in villages exceeding half. The infection rate in livestock is even higher. Frederick discovered that the roundworms in this world were more powerful than those in his hometown in his previous life. The temperature of composting feces could not kill roundworm eggs, and boiling water was necessary. The roundworm eggs, like some plant seeds, had a layer of shell that was difficult to digest and could be transmitted through bird feces. Fortunately, there is a green acid slime in this world. The acid secreted by their digestive cavities can not only dissolve the armor and clothes of female knights and female magic mages, but also digest the outer shell and eggs of roundworm eggs while digesting organic matter that absorbs soil and fertilizer. In theory, throwing acid slime into a manure pile can reduce the spread of roundworms, but the manure pile needs to be used as fertilizer in farmland, and slime acid can harm plants. Frederick had no choice but to use deworming drugs to remove roundworms when they were still in their prime. At this time, individuals would die during composting to reduce transmission. If we can really develop insect repellents that have no side effects or even low side effects and are cheap, it would be equivalent to lying at home and watching the sky rain with gold coins. End of this chapter. Chapter 4, Let's All Stay and Work. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4, Let's All Stay and Work. Frederick first saw Warcraft when he was 3 years old and went on vacation with his family to the estate by Lake Brombach. At that time, an injured rabbit ran to the lake to drink water, and the bloody smell attracted a group of fist-sized yellow slimes. The rabbit saw that Slim was malicious and kicked its hind legs towards the fastest one. Just this yellow slime has a yellow grease on the surface and inside of its body, which is particularly slippery. When used to make pulp, it can be boiled in water and used as lubricating oil. Slim's body looked crystal clear, but felt as elastic as rubber, and with oil on his body, the rabbit's foot slipped open. Frederick was thinking that the rabbit was quite big and should be delicious. Unexpectedly, the rabbit turned around and opened its mouth, spitting out a fireball the size of a glass marble, igniting the slime. 3 years later, Frederick conducted an experiment where he boiled meat soup for an hour and placed it in a porcelain bottle that had just been taken out of the stove fire, then sealed it with wax. However, after 3 days at room temperature, he opened the lid and found that the soup was already broken. The bacteria in the pus on the wound are the same. The pus extracted from the wound is boiled in water for an hour, cooled, and then dripped onto the wound on the rabbit's leg. This wound suppurates faster than the control wound on the other leg. Because of this, he was scolded by his mother on the grounds of not being able to mistreat animals. At that time, Frederick understood that the world of magic was not just about animals turning into Warcraft, but also about microorganisms becoming more demonized and strengthened. Magic had to be used to solve problems. It's just that there have been years of war and chaos here, and the development of magic tends to be military-oriented. No one has the time to think about how to convert from military to civilian. Friedrich pondered for a long time that he had never thought about deworming drugs before. He had been sponsored by a benefactor to study how to kill for decades, and it was the first time he had asked for help. Faced with such a challenging job, he finally said, "I think I can give it a try." Frederick smiled slightly, raised his glass and offered him a drink of juice, then said to Manuel, "Your Excellency is a necromancer and should be familiar with the magic of withering of life. Manuel replied solemnly, "The withering of life is the entry-level magic of a necromancer, used to destroy the enemy's vitality and kill them. This magic is easy to learn but difficult to master. Ordinary apprentices can only kill flowers, plants, and insects, and if they are careless, they can also harm themselves. Magic such as the withering of life appears in various stories as commonly used magic by villainous characters. Killing with a raised hand is a common occurrence, but as he said, it is easy to learn but difficult to master. He was worried that Frederick would have to learn this magic from him, so he took a preventive shot first. Frederick smiled slightly, took a teapot, poured out all the tea inside, and asked the servant to bring a bowl of vegetable and chicken soup to pour into it. Finally, he asked Alfred to bring a candle and seal the spout and lid with beeswax. He said while busy, "I once met a travel scholar who had a microscope in his hand that could see magnified objects. At that time, he showed me many things that looked enlarged, among which there were very small insects moving inside the rotten soup. He said, there are bugs like this everywhere, but if they get too many, they will make food spoil. Unfortunately, I didn't have much pocket money at the time and couldn't buy that microscope. I would like to request your excellency to use life withering to kill all the small insects in this teapot and the broth inside, while not allowing the small insects outside to enter. If it's true as the scholar said, the meat soup without bugs won't spoil for a long time." The question mark on Manuel's head indicates that there are various theories about food spoilage, but this is still the first time I have heard of them. "Is that really the case?" he asked incredulously, and everyone else had the same idea. Frederick replied, "I can't say for sure, only by trying can I know. I have tried several times, and the broth boiled every half day won't spoil, so I have a guess that the small insects in the soup are easy to kill, but their eggs are difficult to kill. I think if I can use the withering of life to kill the small insects and eggs in the soup, it will prove that part of my guess is correct." Manuel seemed quite interested in this experiment and nodded, saying, "Let's give it a try." He asked Frederick to place the teapot on the table, without chanting or using a wand, and directly extended his right hand to aim at the teapot. His 5 fingers skillfully drew different patterns, and a purple-black light appeared on their fingertips. The teapot looks unchanged, quiet, and nothing happens. Manuel's face suddenly became solemn, and she closed her eyes as if feeling something with her heart. "Your guess is reasonable," he said solemnly to Frederick. "I can feel that there is an extremely subtle vitality in the teapot that dissipates under magic. It should be like small insects and eggs, and if you don't pay attention, you won't notice it at all. Well, this needs to be studied carefully." Frederick's face lit up with a smile again, as the influential deceit of sin had arrived, and the others were no longer difficult. His carelessness was soon seen through by others. Diesel raised his glass to pay tribute to him and then asked, "Do you have any new insights into explosive magic? If it's a good research direction, I will stay here for research." At this moment, Afyu suddenly said seriously, "Our master is preparing to dig a canal, so please blast open the soil." Diesel's lips twitched slightly, but he didn't speak. Frederick curiously asked Alfred, "Is there anything unpleasant between you?" Without waiting for Afyu's answer, Diesel immediately said, "Isn't it just bombing the soil?" "No problem, no problem. Accompanying people include professors and students in architecture, which can help them make early plans." Frederick smiled and nodded before saying, "I have a question to ask. I have an idea, which is to find a piece of pipe and plug it at the end. There is a magic-like explosion in the pipe, and a round ball or similar thing is placed inside the pipe. After the explosion magic is activated, it quickly pushes the ball to fly out at high speed. I want to use this weapon instead of bows and arrows. Do you think this can be done?" He wanted to use magic instead of gunpowder, thinking it could be done theoretically, but the actual effect is unclear. In Diesel's melancholic gaze, Afyu said, "Master, he's the best at this kind of thing." Frederick was taken aback and asked, "Why?" Afyu said calmly, "I'll tell the master a story. A long time ago, a few people went to the mountains together to collect herbs and prepared to rest in a cave when it was dark. Just as everyone was preparing to have dinner, a fool discovered a snake crawling out from deep in the cave, so he cast an explosive technique. Frederick blinked, initially wanting to ask if the cave had collapsed, but then thought of another possibility. He asked, "How far did you fly back then?" Afu fell silent for a moment and replied, "This is not the point is that the food cannot be found." Frederick instantly understood what was going on and stopped asking, but instead asked Diesel, "Can my idea just now be realized?" After thinking for a while, Diesel replied, "If it's a substitute for bows and arrows, then the volume of the magic circle cannot be too large, and further research is needed." He had a preliminary plan in his mind, but only a fool would come up with it now, and he would have to rely on it to make money in the future. Frederick naturally agreed and then asked Matthias, "I wonder if you can cultivate crops with higher yields." Matthias said seriously, "Plants also need to eat when they grow, and their food comes from the soil. The larger the crops grow, the more food they eat, and the more barren the land becomes, requiring long periods of fallow to restore soil fertility. Your idea has been tried by someone, but the plunder of land has been too heavy. Including fallow time, the total harvest has actually decreased. I think Your Excellency will also let Monoflow cultivate stronger livestock, but the limited output of the land makes it impossible to have enough feed to feed the livestock." Monoflow nodded in agreement on the side. After listening, Frederick pondered for a moment and said, "I understand this truth. I have learned some knowledge about soil fertility, and we can talk about it later when we have time. In this era, the understanding of fertilizers is still limited to long-term accumulated experience. The use of plant ash, manure, and green manure has made some progress, and there is a certain understanding that legumes with rhizobia can fertilize the field, but there is no awareness that rhizobia are at work." Frederick decided to start pilot planting on several farms for a few years, and once the results were good, they would be promoted. At this point, everyone had a new direction, except for Omet, who was a bit disappointed. Frederick did not look for himself, thinking that the Gold Lord was not interested in the magic puppet. These few of them are not alone, their families are all counted among teachers and students, and they are also academic leaders. They also have their own scholars, professors, and students who rely on their own business to make a living. At this moment, Frederick said, "Your Excellency, I wonder if you would like to stay. I would like to discuss in detail after you settle down, and I would like to ask you about the magic puppet. Perhaps I need to customize a few special ones." Omet's eyes lit up and he immediately replied, "As you wish." End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Start with some profitable inventions. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Start with some profitable inventions. Manuel and others held a plenary meeting the next day and unanimously decided to settle at Wessenland. The meeting also unanimously passed the proposal to establish the University of Wessenberg and elected Baron Frederick von Wessen as the first president. Frederick was initially quite happy, but his face immediately turned black when Alfred quietly told him that the principal needed to be responsible for the school's finances. The landlord's family doesn't have any surplus food either. Wessen's farmland implements a three-garden system, with approximately 1,000 hectares of wheat, 1,000 hectares of beans, 1,000 hectares of grass for grazing sheep, cows, and chickens, and the remaining vegetables. Frederick's father's agriculture and arithmetic skills were just like this. If it were 1,200 hectares of wheat, 800 hectares of beans, and 800 hectares of grazing each, he couldn't calculate how much tax he should collect in a month. Linen. This thing can be bought, but it's troublesome to plant. Why do you plant it? The weather has been good in the past 2 years, coupled with abundant water sources in Wessen, with an average wheat yield of 700 kilograms per hectare and an average yield of 500 kilograms per hectare of various beans. Due to the low yield of newly cultivated land, the Wessen family has set a tax rate of 30%. This means that approximately 200 tons of wheat and 150 tons of various beans will be added to the granary this year, half of which will be sold and generate income of over 100 florin coins. In addition to the cost of using the mill, selling wood, cheese, sheepskin, wooden and iron items, etc., the annual income of the Wesson family is around 500 florins. This income is considered poor among the earls, but exceeds all the barons. However, in last year's war, Wesson's army was completely wiped out, without any war dividends. The expenses for military supplies, pensions, and mercenaries were almost depleted. Currently, Frederick's working capital, apart from over 100 florins, is just harvested wheat. For this reason, Frederick decided to take out his old book and put it on the canal. But now with such a large number of scholars coming, the matter of the canal can only be postponed and settled before we can proceed. The most important thing now is to transport dozens of ships of books brought by scholars, some plants planted in pots, 2 magical puppets, and a lynx shaped like an orange cat to the estate by the lake. These books were rescued by Manuel and his team during the chaos of war. At that time, there were warlords involved in the internal conflict who wanted to use libraries and universities as bases, but negotiations were unsuccessful. Scholars could only carry their collections and go their separate ways. Anyway, that's what they said. Frederick believed it that way. These books cannot be left on the ship anymore. They have been a bit damp for so long, and if they continue, insects will grow. Manuel received Frederick's prompt and took the students to use necromancy to kill the books. It's just that the handling workers are short of manpower. Now is the time to plant beans in the field after the wheat harvest, and the carriage is busy pulling wheat and flour. Frederick could only conscripted corvée, with each person coming out for a day. Like ants moving houses, he used various methods to move books to the lakeside estate. He was currently sitting on a freight carriage with Ahmet, with several boxes of books beside him. A horse weighing nearly a ton was pulling the carriage, creaking along the road. Ahmet took the opportunity of escorting the car to explain to Frederick the process of making a magic puppet. However, Frederick was more interested in the fundamental technologies involved in control core, metallurgy, materials, processing technology, and moving parts. Hydraulic lathes, Frederick pondered, I also have them here, with a lot of manpower. Carpenters use them to turn beads and make dishes. So, can you make cutting tools that can turn metal? Ahmet confidently said, that's simple. Just use magic to strengthen the blade. Frederick pondered for a moment before asking, is the cost of using magic to strengthen metal high? Ahmet smiled mysteriously and whispered, it would definitely be high if someone else did it, but I'm different. I have the latest technology, whether it's strength, hardness, plasticity, toughness, elasticity, or rust prevention, all of which can be done very cheaply. Oh. Frederick looked at him in surprise, then you can make a fortune. Ahmet shrugged his hands and said helplessly, there's no market. Even the cheapest method has a large base, and the total amount is still considerable. It would cost a lot of money to strengthen the weapons of all the soldiers. The generals say this is a waste of money. Those generals need to strengthen their weapons, but they don't lack money and believe more in the magicians they hire. Not to mention commoners, ordinary knives are enough at home. Frederick nodded slightly. These days, soldiers are just consumables, and the outcome of war mainly depends on elite troops and magicians with magic bonuses, such as generals and knights. It doesn't matter whether they are strong or not. He whispered, I have a new invention, can we all get rich together? Oh. Ahmet asked curiously, what is it? Frederick extended his finger, and a slight white light appeared on his fingertips, leaving a white mark on the wooden crate next to him. Illumination is a small magic used for night walking, which is not very difficult, but it is difficult to use for writing and drawing. Ahmet was slightly surprised in his heart, not expecting the child's magical talent to be so high. Frederick said while drawing a wheel, compared to dragging a wooden board directly on the ground, it can be walked more effortlessly with wheels installed. Ahmet said, these are sliding friction and rolling friction, respectively. Next, he spent 5 minutes explaining to Frederick what friction and the effects of lubricating oil are. Although Frederick knew more about physics than he did, he still thanked him and said, now the copper tiles and copper sleeves of our carriage axles are subject to sliding friction, which consumes a lot of force. So why can't we change it to rolling friction? Install wheels between copper tiles and copper sleeves like this. After speaking, he drew a schematic diagram of the ball bearing on the wooden board and explained its structure together. After listening to it, Ahmet thought carefully and said for a long time, "This little thing looks really useful. It's not difficult to make the inner and outer rings, and strengthening is not a problem. However, the small balls inside must be round enough, and in the same set, they should be as similar in size as possible, otherwise it's easy to break." Frederick nodded in agreement. If the ball bearings are not round enough, it will cause vibration. If the size difference is too large, it is easy to have uneven force. If the force on the large ball bearings is too large, it will cause premature damage to the ball bearings. "This is easy to solve," Frederick said with a smile. "Let's do this together. I estimate that if this part were installed on the axle of this carriage, it could double the cargo, and if flour was installed on the water wheel mill, it would be much faster. How many carriages and mills are there on this land? Even if only half of them are equipped with this component, we can see a rain of coins." End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Cheap Steel. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6 Cheap Steel. You're not teasing me, are you? This will get you steel. Ahmet looked at the scorching molten steel in the crucible in front of him, his mouth twitching. At present, ordinary iron-making furnaces have a height of over 1 person and a diameter of about 1 meter. Previously, only block iron-making could be produced. However, more than a decade ago, new iron-making furnaces began to use water-powered wind boxes and coke as fuel to obtain molten iron, resulting in a significant improvement in the quality and output of iron-making. Ahmet believes that he has followed the forefront of the times and has a good understanding of various smelting techniques, but when he saw the process of stir-frying steel, he was still stunned. Can steel be boiled like batter? Who came up with that? He asked excitedly. Can it really be directly turned into steel? Frederick handed him a large roll of parchment and said, "This is what the wandering scholar told me. He said that the difference between wrought iron, steel, and pig iron is caused by different carbon contents, and the carbon content in molten iron can be determined by sparks. Last year, after his father went on a military expedition, his mother prayed in the church all day. The unattended children ran around and came to the blacksmith shop to cause trouble. Anyway, whenever someone asks, they say it's from a previous travel scholar they met. Believe it or not, it's up to you." Frederick gave a glance to the blacksmith Alfred, who was stirring the molten iron. The latter picked out a small drop of molten iron and dropped it on the nearby stone slab, causing the molten iron to explode into several fireballs the size of ping-pong balls. These fireballs are all made up of 1 and 2, 2 and 4, and 4 and 8 sparks, which fall to the ground and bounce a few times. Ahmet found the content of steel flour carbon estimation on parchment and immediately said, "Quickly, add some rust in." Frederick nodded, and Alfred immediately scooped a little rust from the nearby wooden bucket and poured it in. At the same time, he asked his son who was on the side to open the air valve on the air duct connecting the bellows to the maximum. The lower the carbon content of molten steel, the higher the melting point. In order to obtain carbon-free wrought iron, the furnace temperature must be increased, otherwise it will solidify. This is one of the reasons why the current method of stir-frying steel has not appeared. The melting point of pig iron is about 300 degrees Celsius lower than that of cooked iron, and blacksmiths have not mastered the principle, so they will not waste fuel to increase furnace temperature. In Frederick's case, it's different. Just preheating the air in the bellows before entering the iron-making furnace can increase the furnace temperature by about 200 degrees Celsius. After stirring for a while, Alfred's son scooped away the scum, and Alfred dripped a little more molten steel onto the slate. "It's really getting smaller." Ahmet exclaimed, "Unfortunately, the crucible is a bit too small. The diameter of the crucible mouth at present is only over 20 centimeters, and the depth is also about the same. Frederick also said helplessly, "There's no way, there's a problem with the material of the crucible. It's too big and heavy to lift, and it won't break. We can only stop the furnace and let the steel harden before moving it away. There was an accident before, but fortunately it fell into the furnace, otherwise it would have resulted in human life." Omet thought for a moment and said, "I have a solution. When the time comes, I will use heat-resistant steel to make the outer shell of a crucible the size of a water tank, and then apply a layer of crucible material inside. I can do many things at once. We can even purchase pig iron, process it into steel ingots and sell it. I'm afraid the blacksmiths will hate us to death." After listening, Frederick pointed to the near end of the parchment and said, "You can take a look here." Ahmed immediately looked over and his expression became particularly solemn when he saw the converter steelmaking process. "Unfortunately," he said after reading it, "the wind pressure of the bellows does not meet the requirements." Frederick nodded. The theories of indigenous ironmaking and indigenous converter steelmaking are not a problem for him. In his previous life, when he was browsing a station, a owner named 1.95 meters to conquer people with virtue shared a post-apocalyptic survival folder, which contains various indigenous techniques, including but not limited to ironmaking and steelmaking, bearing machine tools, canned salted fish, incubating eggs to treat pig disease, and so on. Having theory is one thing, practical operation is another. The issue with the crucible material almost made him hiccup again. The same goes for the converter. Although the traditional converter can be made, the blower has no effect at the moment. If the wind pressure is not enough, the molten iron will block or even backflow the air outlet. Ahmet watched as the molten iron poured into the mold, while studying the content on the parchment and waiting for the iron ingot to cool. Only then did he believe that the dough mixing method could quickly produce wrought iron and steel. He held a piece of cooked iron ingot and pondered, saying, "Made iron is relatively soft and easy to process, but when used for bearings, its hardness is much lower than steel. Do we still need to apply paste and simmer it in the end? Since the difference in performance between iron and steel is due to the different amount of carbon, the transformation of wrought iron into steel means that the carbon in the coated carbon paste enters the iron at high temperatures." Frederick nodded. What he said about applying paste and stewing was the carboizing process. Carbon paste is a mixture of charcoal powder, oil, and other substances. After being applied to the surface of the workpiece, it is wrapped in high-temperature resistant clay and heated in the fire, which is somewhat like making a roasted chicken. Generally speaking, there will be quenching and tempering next, Frederick added. Omet pondered and said, "The magic enhancement step can be placed before quenching. The material is fine, so we can discuss the specification issue next." Frederick thought for a moment and said, "I suggest using bearings on the waterworks and lathes in the workshop first. Firstly, practice your skills, and secondly, sharpen your axe so that you don't miss the woodcutter." "Feasible," said Ahmet. The two of them left the blacksmith's shop and walked towards the nearby carpenter's shop. At present, the tools are limited and can only run on both sides. It's already afternoon tea time and the weather is nice. In the nearby wheat field, farmers use horses to pull plows to turn over straw and stubble into the ground, and then sprinkle diluted compost. The microorganisms in this world are quite powerful. With high temperatures in summer, the microorganisms in compost can quickly degrade some of the straw and stubble, without delaying the planting of beans later. After the beans are harvested in late autumn, this land will be planted with grass next year. Frederick looked at the farmland and said, "Recently, I have had some inspiration and am designing a machine powered by magic crystals that can quickly plow the fields." Ahmet smiled bitterly and said, "Actually, I have also considered using magic puppets to farm, but magic crystals are too expensive and the cost is too high." Frederick smiled and said, "Your understanding of magic puppets is too one-sided. In fact, they have a wide range of uses. You can teach to control the core arithmetic, Then make a magic puppet specifically designed for calculating numbers, and don't be limited to human figures. For example, inputting numbers using buttons, displaying numbers driven by rotating gears, and so on. A machine that only inputs numbers without calculating errors, I think many merchants will like it. Also, there are many repetitive processes involved in making bearings, especially on machine tools. If you could make a magic puppet specifically designed for these processes, the production efficiency would be much higher. I'll just talk about one thing, the axle. Can there be a magic puppet like this that can make the rough prototype fit the size of the car on its own? Amit was taken aback by the sound. At first, she thought the child was having a wild idea, but upon closer reflection, it seemed very reasonable. First, make the bearings, said Omet. Only when you have money can you research new magic puppets. Frederick nodded. This matter is urgent. If we want to develop an automatic machine tool, at least we need to solve the power problem, which requires the steam engine to come out. At this moment, he didn't know that due to his own negligence, he almost couldn't get the bearings out. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Lack of money and talent. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Lack of money and talent. I'm really stupid, really, Frederick murmured. I only know that doing these requires measuring dimensions, and I don't know if the accuracy of the current ruler is not good. When he came to the carpenter's shop before, he saw the tools of the craftsman and saw a caliper, so he instinctively thought it was a vernier caliper. However, the difference between a caliper and a vernier caliper is like that between a bicycle and an electric bicycle. The caliper is equipped with a vernier, just like a bicycle is equipped with a battery, an electric motor, and a control system. The accuracy of industrial processing is determined by the accuracy of measuring tools. Today's bearings and future steam engines require precision smaller than millimeters. Omet's subordinates had highly skilled craftsmen who originally made jewelry. Later, they carved small magic circles and made a caliper, which was not difficult. However, they encountered difficulties on the vernier scale. It's not a problem for him to measure 49 millimeters, but dividing the length of 49 millimeters into 50 equal parts would exceed his salary range. After explaining the theorem of equal division of parallel lines, Frederick said to Ormet, I found that there are no scholars among you who study mathematics, nor are there any scholars in physics or alchemy. As the saying goes, if you learn mathematics, physics, and chemistry well, you are not afraid to travel through time. Frederick understood how much he possessed. Mathematics is a tool for him, knowing how to use a few advanced tools is one thing, and how to develop tools is another matter. He has not been able to fully understand what number theory is. Calculus can be touched once, but after a few touches, it doesn't work. He returned it to the teacher. Physics is relatively better, as it can transform Newton's 3 laws into Wesson's 3 laws. It is not a problem to further develop motion, light refraction, etc. on the existing basis. Structural mechanics can be considered as the founder, but electricity is currently useless. Forget chemistry, why are there so few people in the field of folk science who specialize in chemistry? Doing this can really kill people. And currently, alchemy involves magic, who knows what will happen if an additional variable is added. Frederick understood that developing industry required the support of mathematical, physical, and chemical knowledge, and he also understood that he could not bear such a heavy burden alone, which required the joint efforts of many people. Just, where should these talents go and how should they be found? After some thought, Almet also had some understanding of these subjects and said, scholars studying algebra and geometry are mostly in the Kingdom of Sardinia, and there are also many in the Kingdom of Gaul. They are currently debating whether algebra and geometry can be unified. Scholars of physics and alchemy are concentrated along the Mediterranean coast, and their experiments require a lot of money to find sponsorship there. Upon hearing the word sponsorship, Frederick was immediately discouraged. At the end of the day, no matter which world you are in, conducting scientific research requires spending money, and what you lack is money. Frederick thought for a moment and said to Amador, "Is it okay for you to handle the work of the vernier caliper and bearings? Next, I need to think about how to make money." Ahmet looked at the principal, who was even younger than his own son, and sighed in his heart, saying, "Leave this to me. Don't get tired, you can go play around when you have time. Don't worry too much about the money. Alfred from the blacksmith's shop has good abilities. He can lead the business of expanding the furnace and buying pig iron for steelmaking, and I will also oversee it. There is a young man named Bryant in the blacksmith's shop who is a skilled blacksmith and can take charge of the iron-making part of the work." Frederick said, "Then I'll trouble you." When he left the carpenter's shop, Ahmet looked at his young back and couldn't help but let out a deep sigh. Among many scholars, Ahmet and Frederick had the longest contact time and the best understanding of this child. This child, at an age when he should have played happily, shouldered the heavy burden of continuing a family. Faced with a conspiracy from the king, he was not afraid but instead planned to confront it head-on. This kind of thing is rarely done by even adults. Frederick walked on the road by the river, with clear water on one side. Several cargo ships were pulling flour downstream, while on the other side was a second plowing of farmland. A group of children his age were throwing a transparent crystal slime into the field, letting them eat the insects and eggs flipped up in the soil. If it were in the past, he would find a place to fish or help throw slime. And now, all he has in mind is how to make money. The money that travelers make is nothing more than a few things, such as glass, soap, paper, and cement. Just to the north of Wesson is the local glass manufacturing center, which has now developed to produce flat glass by blowing a ball and then spreading it out. Frederick's mother has a dressing mirror. Not to mention soap, Frederick was roast about losing his family because he had to bathe with excellent soap made of olive oil every day. People with money would use crude soap made of animal fat. The only thing left for him is paper and cement. The problem is that he has only seen these in traditional Chinese craftsmanship. In theory, he knows the process, but in practice, he needs to slowly explore them. And these things need to be done by someone to oversee the work, otherwise it's just a plan on paper. Frederick saw a crystal slime jump to his feet and picked it up to play. This slime's body is usually relatively soft, but when it comes to running away, it has full elasticity and a good grip. He thought while playing that he needed to discover some talents from his territory, otherwise he would be too busy. "Master," an angry voice suddenly sounded, "why did you catch slime to play again?" Frederick instinctively shrank his neck, threw the slime in his hand, and then kicked it back into the field with a big foot. With his current strength, it only made this slime dizzy for a moment. A maid, aged 17 or 18, went to the side of the river and soaked a cotton handkerchief with river water, complaining about the master's lack of hygiene while wiping his hands. This maid's name is Taro, the daughter of a tax official in Wesson. She started helping wet nurses take care of Frederick when she was 11 or 12 years old. Taro finished wiping the old man's hands, flipped the handkerchief over, and used the other side to wipe his face. Frederick gave up struggling, which was quite good. In the past, when she helped herself take a shower, she could wipe her feet with a cotton towel before wiping her face. Although this older sister may sometimes have a dull mind, she works hard and everyone thinks it's okay for her to be a model worker. After Taro finished dusting himself with a handkerchief, Frederick asked, "How did you come over here? What's up?" Taro then replied, "Someone came to deliver the letter today. Your Excellency Richard Null will be visiting us for 3 days." Frederick's eyes flashed quickly, and he said, "Go back now and inform Calbo that the kitchen is ready with pickled Chinese cabbage and pig's elbows." End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Martial Arts Master. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8 Martial Arts Master. On the day of the summer solstice in the year 1024 of the Gregorian calendar, the sun hung in the air. It had not rained in the past month, and the scorching sun made the grass on the ground wither a bit. Bees and butterflies disappeared without a trace. The farmers in the fields drove their cattle and horses to the fields as the sky was getting dark. They used a columbine to sow peas, chickpeas, and soybeans that the young master had bought from overseas pagans 2 years ago in the wheat fields. This summer is hotter than usual, around 10 o'clock. Farmers have to stop their agricultural work and take their cows and horses to rest under the shade of trees by the field. Fortunately, there are numerous rivers of all sizes in Wesson's territory, and there are water trucks to carry water, so there is no worry of drought in the fields. On the edge of a farm near Wessenburg, a group of farmers were blowing under the shade of trees, discussing strange things on the distant mountain. Not long ago, a few people discovered that the scenery on the mountain was distorted, and it was the cemetery of the Wesson family. The few farmers felt that something big had happened there, while some thought they were dizzy from the heat. The farmers were dizzy, and Frederick in the cemetery didn't know. Anyway, he was a bit dizzy, while Alfred had already fainted and almost bumped his head into Frederick's great-grandfather's tombstone. Just now, Richard Nar, the former friend of Old Wesson, arrived at the grave. His extreme sadness caused him to lose control of his emotions, and the power he released had a huge impact on his surroundings. The power of the Sword Saint is so terrifying. A memory came to Frederick's mind. In his previous life, a friend in his college dormitory went out to sea to fish. One summer, a wealthy friend in his dormitory rented his family's fishing boat and invited everyone to experience going out to sea to fish. Someone was responsible for seasickness. At this moment, he knew he was standing on the grass in the cemetery, but he felt like he was standing on the rough sea, with everything around him fluctuating and shaking. He had to adjust his center of gravity to avoid falling. In Richard Null's eyes, the young son of his old friend was like a bottle hit by a bowling ball, swaying but never falling. He stroked his beard, narrowed his eyes slightly, and made a decision in his heart. After shaking for a few minutes, Frederick finally stopped, and when he stood firm, he heard Richard Null calmly say, "Let's go." Richard Null turned around and walked towards the entrance of the cemetery. As he passed by Affu, he lifted his foot and kicked him in the thigh, sneering, "Don't pretend." Affu stood up expressionlessly, as if nothing had happened, and followed behind Richard Null and Frederick out of the cemetery. After I became famous, there were many people who wanted to know me, but Henry was the most special among all. Richard Null told Frederick of his past. The first time he saw me, he asked me if in the dark, in winter, a fish would drill out of a hole in the river ice by itself. At that time, many people wanted to recruit me, and I thought Henry was trying to establish a relationship with me through my hobbies. After spending a long time together, I realized that he really just wanted to ask what good fishing places are on this land. 4 years ago, when we last met, he told me that you were a smart little guy. After a few years, when you grew up, he would take care of your territory and hire me as a bodyguard to go to the rainforest in the south, the ocean in the west, the ice sea in the north, and the end of the east to see what fish you could catch. Frederick's lips curved into a smile, and his father could indeed do it. "He's fishing at the Star River now," Frederick said. "I think he'll keep Pisces." Richard Null laughed and reached out to touch Frederick's golden hair, saying, "If he doesn't keep it, I'll beat you up every day to show him." Frederick twitched the corner of his mouth, then was startled and asked in surprise, "Do you intend to stay here?" "Are you unwelcome?" asked Richard Null. Frederick scratched the back of his head and said, "I'm afraid there aren't enough pig elbows in the territory." Richard Null smiled and tapped the little guy's head. He continued, "Over the years, I have traveled many places, fought against countless warriors, and witnessed countless martial arts skills. Now I need to find a place to settle down and refine my martial arts skills, while also taking in students." Frederick immediately said happily, "All right, now I have a Wessenburg University on my estate by Lake Brombach. I am the president, and I can appoint you as the vice president. You can focus on studying martial arts and teaching students there. Here, there are a group of promising young people like Jürgen, Lothar, Andre, Gade, Heinz, Bernd, Matthias, Stefan, Oliver, Michael, Miloslav, and so on. They will definitely not insult your name. The old generation led by Wesson, except for the only surviving Franz, have all passed away. The new generation is still young and inexperienced. If it could be taught by internationally renowned swordsmen and scholars from Constantinople, the future is limitless. Richard Knoll's favorite food is the roast pig's elbow with Wesson's collar. This roast pig's elbow is first cut into several cuts and smeared with a sauce made of salt and cheap spices, and then put into an ice cellar to marinate at low temperature for 2 days. Then it is put into high soup and boiled. After drying the sauce and water on the pig's skin, it is smeared with crispy water made of honey, wine, vinegar and water. Finally, it is dried and baked in the oven. After baking, it is put on a plate with a layer of pickled Chinese cabbage. Frederick believed that if Richard Knoll was willing to enroll students at the University of Wessenberg, it would be okay to treat him to 9 grilled pork elbow meals in 3 days. Richard Knoll looked at the child who was counting his head with tears and smiles on his face. If anyone else could understand his suggestion of accepting him as an apprentice, he would be better off. His position and work were arranged first, not only without considering himself, but also without discussing the salary. "Have you never considered yourself," said the sword saint unhappily, "or are you afraid to go to the battlefield? You've been talking for a while without saying how much the vice principal's salary is. Shouldn't you want to use a roasted pig's elbow as a salary for me? The honey used for roasting pork elbow is quite difficult to buy, so let's forget about it." Frederick paused for a moment, scratched the back of his head, and said, "I'm afraid my qualifications are too low and I'll tarnish your reputation." Honey. Oh my. How could I forget this? Richard Knoll was taken aback when he saw this little guy and asked curiously, "Why, what kind of crazy idea did you come up with?" Frederick replied, "I have come up with a sugar that can barely replace honey." Richard Knoll smiled and said, "If we could have this kind of sugar, honey wouldn't be so valuable." "Don't tell me it's lead sugar, that thing is poison." "No, no." Frederick shook his head like a tambourine. "Sugar made from pure grain is non-toxic, and its price is much lower than honey." Richard Knoll shook his head slightly and said, "Don't waste food. How many people have tried something that can replace honey? Not a single one has succeeded in all these years." Frederick said confidently, "No problem, I can definitely do it." Richard Knoll continued to shake his head. There were many people in the world who wanted to make sugar, and now the closest thing to success was sweet wine, which was far from sugar. "You can give it a try." He entered the senior mode, afraid that the son of his old friend would go astray. "But at most, you can only use the same amount of food as your weight. If you exceed this amount, you must stop, and this idea will be dispelled from then on." Frederick was not lacking in nutrition since childhood, and he has not lacked it for several generations. Now, at the age of 8, he has grown to 1.3 meters and weighs 30 kilograms. He thought for a moment and confidently said, "I'm sure I'll succeed in one go." Richard Knoll touched his head and said, "If you really succeed, I'll take you as an apprentice." Frederick thought for a moment and said to him, "If successful, we will split the profit of this business in half." Richard Knoll just smiled, as if it were a child's whim. A few days passed, during which Frederick asked Ah Fu to go to Mingxing City in the south to buy glutinous rice imported from the south. Because the price was not very high due to water transportation, the local people occasionally cooked congee with a fresh picture. On the last day of June, Richard Knoll scooped up a little maltose with a spoon, observed for a long time, and took a sip. His face immediately became heavy. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Training starts from the basics. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Training starts from the basics. Dida. There is a clock room on the second floor of the Wesson family castle, and a clock the size of a wardrobe is working hard. The technical level of this clock is still very primitive, powered by heavy objects hanging on ropes, and the hourly reporting is done by servants on duty in the clock room. The candlelight in the clock room was bright, and the blackboard on the wall read things like, "Wake up the kitchen morning shift at 4.00, Axel and Calpo, wake up Taro at 5.00, notify Taro at the servant restaurant at 5.40, and so on." At 5 o'clock, the servant of the clock room arrived at the door of the Taro room, pulling hard on the rope on the door. A faint bell rang from behind the thick wooden door. As soon as Taro heard the bell, he immediately got up, went to solve the problem, washed himself up, and came back. He took off his pajamas and changed into his work clothes, then went to the servant restaurant. The servant restaurant is next to the kitchen. The cooks on the morning shift have cooked oatmeal congee, boiled eggs and several sausages. Now they are rolling soda bread and preparing to steam mantou. In the Wesson family, there are 3 maids with the highest status, namely Taro, who is responsible for taking care of Frederick, Oxo, who is in charge of the kitchen, and the maidservant Chief Calpo. They are all children of a wealthy family in Wessenberg. They started working in the Wessenberg family at the age of 11 or 12. The oldest one, Calpo, is now 20.1 years old, and the youngest, Taro, is 18 years old in winter. The 3 of them treated Frederick like their own younger brother. In the past, Frederick would help cover up for the old lady when he slept in, sneaked out to play, and made some strange snacks in the kitchen. Recently, Afu has been going on a business trip to another city, and all family matters are being discussed and handled by Taro, Oxo, and Calpo. The servant breakfast time starting at 5 o'clock is the opportunity for them to discuss today's work together. At 5.40, the servant of the clock room came to the kitchen to inform Taro that his own night shift had ended and he would go back to bed after breakfast. At 5.50, Taro arrived at Frederick's room with a basin of cold water, soaked it with a cotton towel, and then wiped it off the old man's face. Frederick suddenly woke up. Frederick's habit was to sleep until he woke up naturally, and to go to bed early when he had nothing to do at night. It was not important to wake up the next day after 8 o'clock, but rather to enjoy the freedom of natural awakening and bedridden. Sometimes bedridden can last until lunchtime. But there's nothing we can do now. At exactly 6 o'clock, he has already appeared on the training ground outside the castle. After arriving in this world, Frederick naturally had a daydream in his heart of splitting mountains with a sword in his left hand and burning rivers with a forbidden curse in his right hand. Now there is a sword Saint Master who feels that he is not far from this goal. Richard Knoll arrived early at the training ground and handed a roll of parchment over expressionlessly, looking at Frederick's hopeful expression. "This is your training plan," he said. Frederick took the parchment with a slight excitement, and by this time the sky was already slightly bright, so there was no problem reading the words on it clearly. Glancing at it, he was so surprised that his mouth was wide open that it could fit a goose egg. The training plan is clearly stated. From 6 p.m. to 7 p.m., daily general physical fitness training, and 2-day specialized physical fitness training, from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m., basic swordsmanship training, from 8.00 to 9.00, breakfast, from 9 p.m. to 12 p.m., cultural courses will be taught, covering topics such as introductory magic, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, arranged by Manuel. Rest at 5 and 0 every day. "Is that all?" Frederick asked his master incredulously. He thought the Sword Saint's training for him was magical and mysterious, but this training plan didn't look much different from the magical world in his hometown. "What else do you want?" Richard Knoll said with a look of your child's reaction, "Forget how old you are. It's time for you to lay a foundation now. If you want to further study, you should wait at least 4 years until you reach the age of 12. The body is the foundation of all martial arts skills. Without strength, speed, endurance, flexibility, sensitivity, and responsiveness, all skills are just empty talk. I know you're in a hurry, but don't be so anxious. Eating 10 days' worth of food a day will only hold you to death." Frederick immediately understood what he meant and said seriously, "Thank you very much for your reminder, Master." Richard Knoll was very satisfied with his humble attitude towards teaching and pointed to both ends of the training ground, saying, "Let's start now. You can run back and forth 2 times first." Frederick followed orders and ran back and forth twice before being called over. "There are many inaccuracies in your running posture," Richard Knoll said seriously, then used a stick as a whip to point and adjust Frederick's running posture. Frederick had never received professional sports training in his previous life, but Richard Knoll developed his own theory through years of practice, which is now perfectly applicable. After running for half an hour, Frederick's running posture finally looked decent and he was sweating profusely from exhaustion. During his rest, he asked his master, "Master, have you ever considered writing your theory into a book and spreading it?" Richard Knoll gave him a deep glance and said indifferently, "Everyone has different qualifications. It's not just a matter of blindly practicing according to books that one can excel at." Frederick fully understood this principle. Students in a class have both good and bad academic performance, and self-study can even widen the gap. However, Richard Knoll pondered, if it could inspire some people, that would be good. "You keep going, run slowly this time, I'll make you stop and then stop again." Frederick continued to run. After the run, Richard Knoll said while he was resting, "The upcoming basic skills training will be boring, but you must take it seriously. Regardless of the type of martial arts, they are all composed of corresponding basic skills. You can treat basic skills as letters, and moves are words composed of letters. Words can also form sentences, sentences can form articles, and articles can form a book. You need to practice basic movements until your body firmly remembers them, whether it's extreme fatigue or encountering accidents, you can subconsciously use them. The first thing you need to learn today is footwork. The footwork can be regarded as the foundation of all martial arts skills. Whether a person has received training or not can be seen from the position and movement of their feet. You first learn the most basic footwork techniques such as stab, send, lean, diagonal, and turn, and then become proficient in other footwork derived from them. After you finish learning the footwork, you can learn several basic postures such as rooftop, bull, ho, and fool. Similarly, once you become proficient, you can learn derivative postures. In addition to long swords, you also need to learn wrestling, short swords, armored combat, spears, and cavalry combat. Those who are interested can learn long-handled axes, crescent knives, single-handed swords with small round shields, and long sticks. At the same time, you need to learn the forecasting methods of body strengthening, enchanting attacks, magic detection, and magic shields. Frederick felt a bit dizzy and had a feeling of returning to high school to listen to his teacher talk about the exam points. The difference is that if you don't do well in the college entrance examination, you won't die, while as a nobleman, it is your duty to go to the battlefield. If you don't have strong martial arts skills, you can only send heads to the enemy on the battlefield. After resting, Frederick began to stand up according to Richard Knoll's request, holding a long wooden sword in his hand, and following the demonstration to learn footwork. While he was practicing, Richard Knoll suddenly asked, "Do you know the difference between a typical swordsman and a sword saint, or an ordinary high-level wizard and a magic god?" Frederick's footsteps did not stop, he just shook his head. "Domain," Richard Knoll said seriously, "I dominate everything within the domain." Frederick was puzzled when he suddenly felt a change in his surroundings. He felt like he was in a very special world, where vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and spiritual exploration were suppressed. His body movements encountered great resistance, and even breathing became difficult. At the same time, it seemed that countless eyes were staring at him from all directions. Richard Knoll's voice echoed around him, "This is just the most basic field. Different people have different special abilities in their fields. If only you could force me to use my special abilities." Frederick gasped for breath and asked with difficulty, "Master, how do you learn the realm?" "I don't know," Richard Knoll replied, "everyone will naturally become proficient after possessing extremely high strength. As for me, I probably didn't know before going to bed that day, but when I woke up, I realized that my field had appeared. Frederick was speechless for a moment, which was too profound to understand. But this also aroused his curiosity, and he decided in his heart that he too wanted to reach this level in order to unravel this mystery. Richard Null watched as his expression and gaze changed, and smiled contentedly. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Strategic Deterrence Force. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Strategic Deterrence Force. A new shop has recently opened in the city of Wessenberg, owned by Nina, a former maid who has served the Wessenberg family for over 20 years. Nina is 40 years old this year. Her father is a family businessman of the Wesson family and passed away a few years ago. Nina's husband Johnny inherited her father-in-law's job and performed well. He is now sent to Mingxing City to sell Wesson syrup and Wesson candy blocks, which are maltose and ding-tang. It's just that Nina has a tendency to talk outside about things in the castle. Frederick never liked her, so she resigned voluntarily after the new master started taking care of the house. Frederick remembered her years of hard work, so he gave her money to open a steam bread shop. Compared with bread, mantou can save fuel, time and space, so it is cheaper. The mantou just made is much softer than bread, and with the addition of little master invention, it sells well. On that day, a diplomat from the Principality of Mainz, Baron Philipp von Ertl, was passing Weissenberg to Mingxing City in the Principality of Bayern. When the motorcade passed the mantou shop, it saw the steam outside the shop. Curious, it stopped the carriage to have a look. Nina saw a customer coming and was about to take care of the business, but was taken aback for a moment. She immediately bowed behind the counter and said, "Welcome Baron Elter to my shop." Philip was taken aback. He didn't expect a landlady on the roadside here to know him, and her etiquette was so standard. Are all the residents of Wesson's estate monsters? He had a good memory and soon remembered that the landlady had seen him before, probably a servant in the castle when she came to Weisenling as a guest 3 years ago. Nina remembers Philip purely because he was dignified, gentle, and the most dazzling presence among many guests. Philip curiously asked her, "What are you selling?" Nina respectfully replied, "To my lord, I am selling steamed bread invented by our Baron Wesson." She said that she put some mantou in a clip on the tray of the counter. In Weisenling and many places, because bread is an important material for ensuring the survival of residents, publicly sold bread is subject to specific legal provisions, commonly known as the Bread Act. The wheat flour ground in the mill is divided into 4 types. Rough flour with bran, ordinary flour with only bran screened out, excellent flour blown by a windmill from ordinary flour, and fine flour. According to the law of Weisenling, all bakeries can only sell 6 types of bread. Excellent white bread with salt added, regular bread, regular mixed grain bread made of regular flour and chestnut or bean powder, bran bread, and bran mixed grain bread. If you want to buy high-quality bread made from high-quality flour, you have to go to the castle to buy it. Ordinary people can't afford such expensive bread all year round, and it doesn't sell well on a regular basis. At the same time, the prices of various types of bread are fixed, and if there are fluctuations in grain prices, the size of the bread can only be changed, not the price. Steam bread is also bread, which is also managed by the bread law, so there are 6 kinds of mantou. Frederick didn't sell steamed buns, mainly because the legal issue of whether steamed buns belong to bread or dim sum was not clear. Selling dim sum is not the same as selling bread. The tax rate on necessities like bread is very low, and dim sum is much higher. Now, the scholars studying law in Wessenberg University have been discussing this matter all the time. In addition, with the disturbance of cereals, bread and steamed rolls, this matter has risen to the philosophical question of how to define quantitative change and qualitative change. Philip did not know that this later made Frederick have a place in the philosophy circle. At this time, he was concentrating on studying several mantou in front of him. Excellent mantou is as white as snow. It is soft to poke with your fingers. It is made of local high gluten flour that is slightly elastic. It is warm when it just comes out of the steamer, which reminds him of his daughter's little face. Nina used to gossip about things in the castle. This steam bread is delicious, even Lord Richard Nr. likes to eat it. It's said that every night he has a plate of roast pig's feet, a plate of steam bread and a large glass of beer. After eating the roast pig's feet, he uses steam bread to eat pickled Chinese cabbage. Philip suddenly grasped the key point of this sentence and asked with a casual expression, "Are you referring to Lord Richard Null as His Excellency, the Sword Saint Richard Null?" "Of course." Nina said proudly, "Lord Richard Null came last month and he is now the master of Baron Wesson. I heard he teaches him how to use the forbidden curse every day. I also heard that Lord Richard Null will teach students at universities in the north in the future. We, who used to work for the master, all have a spot for Mr. Richard Null's student, which is feasible for the unpopular one in my family." Philip didn't listen to her. He asked his servant to come over with a basket and buy a few mantua of each kind. Then he left. On the carriage, Philip quickly wrote a letter to Frederick, stating that he was in a hurry on this journey and had no time to stop. He would definitely visit on his return journey. Frederick received the messenger at breakfast after finishing his first day of training, and after a few polite words, he let him leave. After completing the delivery task, the messenger settled in the city and inquired about local news every day. In the restaurant, Richard Null sneered and asked Frederick, "Did you spread the news that I came?" Frederick didn't make any excuses and answered directly, "Yes, our neighbors nearby and the kings far away all want to take a bite while we are weak. They will definitely not act rashly when they know our master is here." Richard Null pointed to Manuel and several other scholars who were having breakfast together with his chin and said, "We can indeed scare those jackals for you here, but I will make a rule for you. We can help you protect your territory, but you have to do it yourself to expand your territory." Manuel continued, "With your Excellency Richard Null with us, the enemy won't attack openly, but there will definitely be various small actions. I have studied the surrounding situation, and the Wesson family and several nobles around are the chess pieces arranged by your king between the Duchy of Mainz, the Duchy of Bane, and the Free City of Nuremberg. Last year's defeat caused your king to lose face and confidence, and the surrounding chess pieces were somewhat unstable. Therefore, your king used you as meat to feed the surrounding chess pieces and let them continue to be loyal to themselves. We are not good at political matters, otherwise we wouldn't have escaped from Constantinople. I suggest that you recruit at least 2 professional talents in the future." Frederick stood up and solemnly thanked both of them. Now that there is a sword saint and many wizards from the University of Wessenberg in the territory, it is equivalent to a country having a nuclear warhead and an elite army. The problem is that King William, as well as neighboring Archdukes Bern and Mainz, have more nuclear warheads in their hands, and the Wessons are only leading in terms of per capita numbers, making all parties feel that it is not cost-effective to confront the small Wessons. Strategic deterrence is the greatest role played by Richard Null, Manuel, and others in Wessenland. Not being reckless in military affairs does not mean that he will not take action in politics, and Frederick is completely ignorant in this field. Frederick said to everyone, "The most precious thing in this world is talent. If a territory wants to develop and grow, it cannot do without the help of various talents. Now master and scholars have provided a protective umbrella for Wessenberg, which is an advantage that can be leveraged to attract talents from around the world through Wessenberg University's platform." Richard Null gave him a cold glare and said angrily, "You're trying to use me as a gimmick again, right? Believe it or not, I'll hang you from a tree and smoke." Frederick showed a cute smile on his face, attempting to sneak through the level. Manuel said somewhat awkwardly, "This advantage is not obvious." Frederick thought for a moment and asked, "What if our school treats all scholars and schools equally?" Manuel frowned and asked, "What if the infidels come?" Frederick was taken aback for a moment, not thinking about the question. After thinking about the time it took to finish a white sausage, he replied, "It's just academic. He is not very interested in religion, and going to church to participate in team-building activities is just a formality. The power of the Church of Light is not great now, and its strength is directly proportional to the degree to which the Lord is deceived. But the Church also had value that could be utilized, and Frederick decided to discuss business with them later. However, this business is also useful for the development of universities, so Frederick said to Manuel, "Recommend 2 students with good character and flexible minds to me. I have important research to hand over to them and have done at least one jazz well." Because knight and cavalry are often confused, knight is often used instead of knight when referring to knightly titles. Although knights are only working-class members of the nobility, they have their own fiefs and belong to the landlord class family that has separated from the proletariat. In tradition, knightly titles are not permanently hereditary, only passed down for 2 or 3 generations. If descendants fail to make contributions and maintain their family business, they can only return to the proletarian family. In this era, apart from the children of merchants and skilled craftsmen, there were very few opportunities for ordinary people to receive full-time education and training. Therefore, as long as there were no offspring or strange things, the knighthood could be inherited. This reward is extremely tempting for ordinary scholars. Even Manuel is pondering whether to have her own children occupy a spot. Richard Knoll had one experience with Malthus, and this time he first asked, "What are you planning to do?" Frederick replied, "I don't know if something that can replace parchment will succeed." He decided to use papermaking and printing as a means to attract scholars and make money. At the same time, it can also gain reputation among the academic community, making some people hesitant about doing things themselves. Without talent, there is no talent. It's not impossible to start from scratch and explore slowly. Richard Knoll asked again, "Is it okay for women?" Frederick raised his eyebrows and asked his master with a wicked smile, "Are you pretty?" Richard Knoll sneered and said, "My daughter." End of this chapter.